Have you ever thought about what a whistle sounds like? I mean, not just any whistle, but one that literally marked the time for an entire city. Yeah, I know. Sounds kind of weird, right? But imagine this. You're out in Jacksonville. It's the early 1900s, and like every single day you're hearing this big old whistle blasting across town. That whistle was Big Jim. Ever heard of him? Or I guess it. But around here we gave it a name like it was one of us. Big Jim was more than just noise. It was like the city's clock, its heartbeat. And if you were living in Jacksonville, well, you didn't need to check your watch or anything. Big Jim let you know when it was time to start work, when to eat lunch, and when the day was finally done. Today, we're diving deep, like really deep into the story behind Jacksonville's most famous, most boisterous resident. So sit back, relax, and maybe keep your ears peeled because you might hear Big Jim again. All right, let's get into it.
Welcome to Old Florida Now, where we uncover the rich history and hidden stories of the Sunshine State. Each episode will explore the people, places, and events that shaped Florida's past. Let's dive in.
So let's rewind a bit. Big Jim didn't just appear out of nowhere. This iconic whistle was actually built in the late 1800s by a guy named John Einig. Now, if you haven't heard of him, that's okay. I personally grew up hearing tales about him. He was my great-great-grandfather, and he was one of those local inventors who left quite a mark on Jacksonville. I mean, the guy even built Jacksonville's first car. Yeah, no joke. He was kind of ahead of his time. Anyway, Big Jim, our steam whistle friend, was installed on top of what's now the GEA building. But back then, it was just called the Jacksonville Electric Authority. This thing wasn't just for show either. It had a real job. Big Jim would blow at 7 a.m., noon, 1 p.m., and again at 5 p.m., like clockwork. And it was kind of like the city's alarm system, telling all the factory workers when to clock in, when to eat, and when to finally call it a day. It basically kept the whole city in sync for decades. It's wild to think about, right? All right, so let's talk a little more about why Big Jim was such a big deal beyond just, telling folks when to go to work and when to head home. It wasn't just a whistle. It was kind of like the voice of Jacksonville. I mean, for years, Big Jim wasn't just marking time. It was signaling, well, everything. Like, think about this. If something big happened in the city, chances are Big Jim was right there letting everyone know. One of the most famous moments was during the Great Fire of 1901. That fire pretty much wiped out downtown Jacksonville, right? And the whole time, Big Jim was wailing through it like a citywide alarm, telling people, hey, this is serious. Get to safety. It really showed how crucial that whistle was for the community. And then it wasn't just emergencies. Big Jim also celebrated the good times. After World War I ended, Big Jim blew for that. New Year's Eve. You guessed it. Big Jim made sure the whole city knew it was time to ring in the new year. Heck, if there was a hurricane on the way or some other disaster, Big Jim had your back. It became more than a whistle. It was part of Jacksonville's DNA. It's kind of wild to think about how much impact one steam whistle could have, right? All right, so let's dig into the nuts and bolts of Big Jim for a second, because this thing wasn't just any old whistle. Big Jim is a 32-inch copper steam whistle, which is like massive, right? And what's even crazier is that you could hear it from 10, sometimes even 15 miles away. Imagine that. You're sitting at home or in the middle of the city, and boom, that deep resonant sound just cuts through everything. It was a big part of Jacksonville's soundscape for sure. So how did it work? Well, back in the day, Big Jim was powered by steam, as you'd guess from a steam whistle, right? It was hooked up to the waterworks system. High pressure steam flowed into it, and that's what let it belt out that iconic sound. And trust me, it wasn't some wimpy little toot. This thing had a real presence. You didn't just hear Big Jim, you felt it. I mean, you could be miles away and still get that rumble in your chest. And what I got to say is it's wild to think something as simple as steam, copper, and a bit of pressure could create a sound that defined a whole city for decades. Kind of cool, huh? All right, so here's where things get a little tricky for Big Jim. Over time, Jacksonville kept growing, right? And with that growth came new technology, new buildings, and new complaints about the old whistle. I mean, Big Jim wasn't exactly subtle, you know. By the early 2000s, folks were starting to say it was a bit too loud, especially with all the residential areas popping up near downtown. So in 2004, Big Jim actually went silent for a bit. Noise pollution laws and city ordinances kind of clashed with its longstanding tradition. So, yeah, they had to put a pause on it. A bunch of party poopers, if you ask me. But here's the thing. People missed it. Like, Big Jim had been such a part of daily life in Jacksonville that when it went quiet, there was a real push to bring it back. And sure enough, thanks to public support and a little help from JEA, Big Jim made its comeback. Now, the most notable time was in 2013. Get this, after lightning actually damaged the whistle, but they got it fixed up and boom, Big Jim was back in action. So yeah, even though technology and, noise complaints tried to silence Big Jim, this old whistle just refuses to stay down for long. So let's talk about what Big Jim means now, especially for folks who've been around Jacksonville for a long time. I mean, for older residents, Big Jim isn't just a whistle, right? It's a memory. It's this nostalgic symbol of a time when life was a little slower, and the sound of that whistle kind of set the rhythm of the day. I've heard people say it's like this comforting reminder of the past when you knew exactly what time it was just by hearing that boom echo across the city. Generations of people literally grew up with Big Jim as part of their daily routine. It was there when they were kids walking to school. It was there when they were heading home from work. And yeah, it was even there during some of the city's biggest moments, good and bad. Now, even though Big Jim doesn't have the same functional role today, we've all got phones and watches telling us the time. It's still this cherished part of Jacksonville's history. It's something that connects the past to the present. And even though the city's changed a lot, hearing Big Jim every now and then, it's like this little piece of history that refuses to fade away. So here's where Big Jim stands today. It still blows, but definitely not as often as it used to. These days, it's more of a special occasion thing, kind of like a nod to the past, a little reminder of where the city's been and how far it's come. It's almost like a living piece of history. For me personally, it's nice to still have that living, for lack of a better word, piece of history that connects me to my great-great-grandfather. Big Jim might not be marking the workday like it did back in the day, but it's still got this presence. I mean, when you hear it, even now, there's this connection to Jacksonville's roots. It's a reminder that the city's story isn't just written in the buildings or the streets. It's in the sounds that echo through time, just like Big Jim. So, yeah, that's the story of Big Jim, still standing, still blowing, and still a part of the city's soul. Your speakers aren't messed up. That's a recording of the actual Big Jim steam whistle blowing, and this is just a sample. It goes on like this for a bit. All right, y'all. That's a wrap for today's episode of Old Florida Now. Thanks for tagging along as we dove into the story of Big Jim. Hopefully, you learned something new, or at least got to see Jacksonville's history from a fresh angle. And hey, if you're digging these deep dives into Florida's past, like the quirky stories and, those little forgotten details, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Rate the show, give it a follow, and share it with a friend who might be into Florida's rich, unique history. So we've got a lot more stories to tell, so stick around. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Old Florida Now. Stay tuned for more stories from the Sunshine State's past. Until next time.